Hi, I'm Annie with Polar Explorers, and I'm going to show you some tips and reminders on how to use the Whisperlite stove. The Whisperlite stove is a great stove for our cold weather polar expeditions. It works really well in cold conditions. It's also really easy to use and fairly easy to maintain. The Whisperlite stove is a liquid fuel stove. It runs on liquid fuel. If you were right next to my ear right now, you'd hear the fuel sloshing around in this container. A couple of things about liquid fuel stoves. One, they work on pressure. So we need to build up enough pressure in this bottle to push the fuel out of the fuel bottle, down a fuel line and into the stove, and then up and into the air so it can be used. Another thing about liquid fuel stoves is that the stove has to be hot enough to convert this liquid fuel into a gaseous fuel to be burned. One other thing, you'll notice that I'm wearing some gloves. It's not that cold outside today, but if I were in the polar regions or even somewhere training where it was very cold, I would always have gloves on when I'm working with my stove, because you can get instant frost injuries if you touch fuel or a very cold fuel bottle with your bare hands. So with the MSR Whisperlite, we have the fuel bottle, the stove, and the pump. And right now we're going to talk a little bit about the pump. So as I mentioned earlier, in order to get this liquid fuel to the stove, we've got to create pressure in the fuel bottle that pushes the fuel up and out of the fuel bottle. So we need to take the cap off the fuel bottle. I'm just going to set that down real quick and show you the pump. Now this is the pump. It has a pumping mechanism right here, right there. And this is where the fuel goes. It's got a little filter right there. And then this is where you turn it on and off. So it's a little knob where you can turn it on and off. So to get the fuel into the fuel bottle, we got to fit all the components inside the bottle. So you kind of just maneuver it however you can to get all the pieces into the fuel bottle, just like that. And then you just screw it on. Great. So now our pump is on the fuel bottle. And now we just pump it up. You can feel the pressure building. If you don't have very much fuel in your fuel bottle, it'll take sometimes 30 or more pumps. But I've got quite a bit of fuel. It's probably to about right here, and I can already feel it getting pretty hard to pump. You don't want to pump too much after you feel that pressure build up. You want to stop, because you can overpressurize the stove and it doesn't work so well. But let's just test this. I've got my fuel pumped up, and I'm going to turn it on, and let's see if there's enough pressure in there to force the fuel out of the bottle. Oh, you can see it there. It's leaking out right now. So there is enough pressure in there. I just turned it off, but you can see there's fuel coming down. There is enough pressure in there right now to force the fuel out of the fuel bottle. So this is the MSR Whisperlite Stove component of the stove. And you can see here it's got a burner, it's got some legs which fold down for packing. It's got a spirit cup, which is where the fuel gets held when we're warming the stove up or priming it. And then it's got this fuel line that runs from the fuel bottle. We'll connect it right here. It goes from the fuel bottle to the stove. So when we pressurize the fuel bottle, and if we've got enough pressure in there to force that fuel out of the bottle, that fuel is going to travel down this line here. It's going to go down to the bottom of the stove, and it's going to shoot up, and that's what's going to light the flame. To connect the stove to the fuel bottle, you simply put the fuel line right by this silver block into the hole of the pump right there. So we're just gonna pair them together. Dun 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 dun! And we're gonna push them together until the two are flush, right there. Then we're gonna take this locking mechanism that's on the stove, and we're gonna bring it over the top of the pump, and we're gonna lock it into this groove here, right there. Lock it into the groove on the pump. So now the stove and the pump are mated. So the stove and the fuel bottle are mated, and the fuel bottle is pumped up. I'm going to give it a couple more pumps. Yep, I can feel that pressure. And you'll notice that I'm using a wooden board. I've got a stove board. That's really critical when you're using a stove in snow. Otherwise, the stove will just sink down through the snow. Other things to think about right here, I want to make sure there's nothing flammable around this. You can see my gloves are here. I'm going to move them out of the way. And if my hair gets in the way, I'm going to pull it back. So we're all attached again. I'm going to turn on the stove. It's going to release some fuel into the fuel line. The fuel line is going to travel. The fuel is going to travel down the fuel line to the spirit cup. And I'm going to fill that spirit cup up about halfway with fuel. And so I'm going to turn on the stove. And I'm going to hear a little hiss. You probably won't hear that. I'm going to have to turn this quite a bit. And there's the hiss. And I can see the fuel is coming into the fuel cup. I'm going to turn that off when I see the fuel, because as I turn it off, additional fuel will continue to fill up the spirit cup. If you can see this now, which you might not be able to, it's full of liquid fuel. So I'm going to take my lighter and just light that on fire. And this is called priming the stove. What we're doing is we are heating up the generator, which is a little piece of metal in there that the fuel needs to travel through in order to get to the upper burner. And this takes a minute. We're just going to let it burn. But you can see how high the flame is. So if you've got socks drying out, or if you've got long hair, or this fuel bottle, these are all things I'm watching and keeping an eye on. If you're inside your vestibule and the tent is right here, you want to make sure that nothing's going to catch on fire or be burned during the process of heating up that generator. Now this is really normal to have flames come up this high. And this is one part of lighting a stove that a lot of people don't like, because they don't like having big open flames like this. It makes them nervous when you've got things like fuel cans around and whatnot. I get that. But this is totally normal for the priming process. Now you can see that the stove is beginning to burn out. And it's off right now, and there it goes. I can even blow it out a little bit to help. I'm going to turn it back on right away. We're going to hear a different hiss, and I'm going to light that. Now we've got a stove where the stove is now hot. So the fuel that's going down through that fuel line gets converted from liquid into a gas. And I've got a beautiful blue flame right here that you can't see, but it's heating up nicely. It's really a regular flame. It's not spinning yellow or orange. And this is what I'm going to use to cook. I'm going to pump it a few more times now that it's on. And I'm going to notice that the flame goes from a kind of a shh to a shh. It's a lot stronger. Now, if I had all the components of the stove with me, I'd have a windscreen, and I'd also have a little fuel, a little reflector down there. I don't have those with me right now, so I'm not going to use them. This is more about how to turn the stove on and how to get it burning. So the stove is burning great. I'm going to put on my kettle. I'm going to melt some water, maybe make up a really nice dinner. And when I'm done cooking, actually let me back up. Throughout the meal, the stove might begin to seem less strong. You might hear it putter. And if that's the case, it just means that the fuel is being used up. There's more space in the can, and so we need to continually add more pressure to keep that fuel going through here and being forced down into the stove. So it's not that once you set it up and turn it on, you can just forget about it. You always have to be monitoring it, and you've got to be listening to the flame and the roar of the stove to know if you need to be pumping it more or less. When it's time to turn it off, all you do is you take this, and you're going to turn it in a clockwise rotation, and if you can hear it, the stove is going to go off. It takes a little bit of time. It putters a few times, and it'll eventually go out. The stove will stay hot for a while, so you want to make sure you give it plenty of space while it's cooling down. Okay, the stove is now cooled off, so I'm going to should be cooled off. I'm going to take it apart and show you how that works. So importantly, I'm making sure that the fuel line is turned off. No fuel is going from the bottle into the fuel line anymore. I can pick this up. I'm going to unlock the locking mechanism. And then I'm just going to pull that fuel line out from the bottle. Got to wiggle it a little bit. There we go. They're now separated. And then when I open the pump, you're going to hear a hiss. That's all the pressure that's in the bottle, leaving the bottle. And I can take my pump out now. And I can replace it with the fuel cap. When I put caps on my fuel bottles, I always like to give it a little tip test to make sure that the cap is on all the way and that no fuel is leaking. So that's the basics of using the MSR Whisperlite. We look forward to seeing you soon on one of our expeditions or on one of our polar shakedown trainings.